for a while, meaning 20 years, right? And it never gets boring. Although there have been stretches where when you're writing these press releases for the Realtors Association, you're trying to find different ways each month to say basically the same thing. All right, and we get into that, got into that a little bit the last couple of years. You know, the housing market is something that is a very interesting industry to be associated with. And we are going through some interesting times. So what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about the housing market as it relates to the economy, which is evolving. Right? The economy is always evolving, but it's moving in an interesting direction now. I want to focus on that a bit today. So,
I think it's like the left button. There we go.
so,
All right. So we
one of the good things to note is that in spite of some of the turmoil that's taking place, the economy is continuing to grow. Okay, came out of a recession. That recession was we've continued to grow off of the last recession. So what this picture is a picture of real gross domestic product. Think of real gross domestic product as simply the output of the entire economy. Private sector, public sector. And so, and the little shaded areas are recessions. All right, and we've had short recessions. The most recent recession was very short. And we've had longer recessions. The one, the so-called Great Recession, went on for a year and a half. Right? We've had recessions that have been spaced out we've had expansions that have been spaced out over 9-10 years. Right? With the one early 60s recession followed by early 70s recession. The 1990 recession followed by the one in 2001, 1991 recession, and then 2000 to 2008, and then the one that our longest expansion was that period between 2000 and 9, basically the middle of 2009 to most recent recession that started in March of 2020. So that was one. That's our longest expansion in the history of the nation, and we essentially had 128 months of upward moving GDP. And so if we look at this, one of the things that you see is, wow, we saw a pretty sharp decline. And that was an unprecedented decline. So if we less trigger happy. One of the things that you can see is that if we focus on that decline and then the recovery, we had this sharp decline that took place in the second quarter of 2020. We're still trying to figure out what happened, but I think something happened that caused that decline by 31.2%. And it's important to note that in fact the recession began in March, and it was significant enough. GDP broke down by 5.1%, but the hammer came down after that. And the hammer that came down obviously was COVID, and the subsequent shutdown of the economy that took place in that second quarter, basically. End of the first quarter, March, and then April, and we started to see some reopening in May. And then you look at what happened in the third quarter. We were up by 33.8%, right? So we have not quite, and then we grew at very robust rates through the rest of 2020 and first couple of quarters of 2021, and then it settled down in the third quarter. These are preliminary numbers on the third quarter, but GDP growth for the third quarter of this year was 2%, was about 2%. But you can, if you look at the history, just over the past couple of years, you have a period of relatively consistent growth, not overly heated, but certainly moving in the right direction. And then we have this period of relatively high volatility. Okay, and so if you look at GDP growth on an annualized basis, you know, it's tended to be in the 1.5 to just under 3% range until we got to 2020. Not surprisingly, 2020 was negative, mainly as a result of the first 2 quarters. All right, but just going back to the previous picture, we are growing. We have recovered most of what was lost in terms of and the indications of those who analyze the tea leaves of the macroeconomy on a regular basis are that we are experiencing continued growth looking at the next 1 to 3 years. Okay? So that's good news. But there are headwinds. Headwinds are a way of kind of conveying that there are things that we need to keep growth from being at its potential. And they're primarily on the supply side of the economy. So one of them is supply chain. And you know, there are terms that kind of pop up at different times in our history. Hard for now. Supply chain is one of them. Everyone kind of thought supply chain can be an issue prior to the pandemic, but we never realized how much of a constraint it would be. Right? The supply chain challenges are significant, they're real, and they are keeping the economy from growing faster than otherwise. Right? And so these pictures of these, I think this is coming from the West Coast, but these container ships that are just sitting at anchor waiting for the opportunity to unload. And so when you hear stories about, we may have some challenges getting all the toys that you might want to be buying at Christmas time to the shelves of the department stores, is because they're sitting in these containers waiting to be offloaded. And so that's a challenge. But it's not just getting them off the ship. Once they're off the ship, they have to move to rail sites, trucks to be moved in, and we've got some challenges there as well. Second headwind, our energy prices. So I've got this a couple of charts to show you here. One is the crude oil. Right? You can see that there was a brief time where I had a friend who was able to buy gas for 99 cents. And that's taking place. I just want to do that.
Are we going forward? I can just click it.
So you can see the declining crude oil prices. You know, that was as a result of dramatic prices. It was great to buy 99 cents a gallon of gas. There was no place to go, right? state of Illinois said, don't come or you'll have to quarantine for a couple of weeks. We don't really want to go to Illinois anyhow, but nonetheless, that probably kept some of them from coming up here. And and then as the economy continued to grow, you could see this increase in prices. The increase in prices are exacerbated by some policy decisions of the current administration that have reduced supplies. But in any case, we have these rising crude oil prices. We also have these rising natural gas prices, right? And so as we move into the winter months in the upper Midwest, we know that we use quite a bit of natural gas, and unfortunately, those gas prices are rising. And some of it is the regulatory issue. Some of it is the fact that other economies are starting to grow. This is certainly not unprecedented. You can see that there are periods within the last decade or so that we've been in this area of natural gas. But the expectation is it's going to continue to rise. Right? Another headwind. Right? That as we're going to see, both of these effects are going to be manifest in terms of headwinds on the growth of the economy, but also in terms of inflation. And then finally, we've got these ongoing labor shortages. And so what this is the labor force participation. What's the labor force participation rate? Well, essentially, you look at the number of people who are either employed or looking for work. And you divide that by the working age population. You can see that you know, in normal times, you're in the 65, 66, 67% range. All right, we've fallen into the 60 to 61% range. Now, it's not surprising that a bunch of people found themselves out of the labor force during the pandemic. Right? There were some government programs that actually encouraged people to remain outside, right? And when those programs, they were basically federal enhancers to unemployment benefits. Once they elapsed, and there were some states where they elapsed sooner than others, but once they discontinued those, you had people kind of move back into labor force. But when you've got people who are in their early to mid 60s, they may decide to basically call it a career. Okay? And so it may encourage some people to leave the labor force and not come back. Now, it's not to say that they weren't ultimately going to make that decision, it simply makes the decision easier. So those labor shortages we're talking about, the challenges associated with the supply chain, we're having problems finding truck drivers. We're having problems finding enough containers to be able to ship goods and services. We're sitting full on ships. I mean, there's all kinds of challenges that are potentially constraining the economy related to supply chain, related to prices, related to labor shortages. Labor shortages will drive up wages as well. All right, and so a major concern that economists have now are the inflation. So this is a diagram showing think of it as the percentage change in the consumer price index. What a price index does is it says, we've got this whole basket of goods that people, think of a typical basket of goods that is bought on a Let's look at the prices of goods and see how the expense associated with that basket of goods has changed over time. Right? So what's in the basket of goods? Energy in the basket. Housing in the basket. Right? foods in the basket of goods, clothing, all of the typical things that people buy. And so when you see this inflation rate being 1.2%, that's saying that basket of goods is about 1.2% higher. That's how we measure inflation. There's different baskets that we'll look at. All right. Here I'm focusing on the consumer price index. Sometimes I look at core inflation. Core inflation pulls out the more volatile components of the basket, food, energy, and housing. Okay, tend to be a bit more volatile, but the picture would look the same. Okay, and so you can see this was kind of in its historical long run pattern right up until you got into February into March and April of this year. So instead of being in the 1 to 2% range, in March it jumped up to 2.6%. That caught a lot of economists by surprise, and you had people start saying, we need to see if this is a kind of temporary blip, or if this is something that's a little bit more systemic. April, 4.2, May, 5%, and then it's been in the 5.3 to 5.4 range right up until the most recent pattern. So what this is looking at is looking at how much did that basket of goods cost in September compared to the previous September. So it's an annualized figure. And that is well outside of the Fed's comfort range. So the Fed has dual mandates. All right. One is to maintain full employment. The second is to keep prices from rising too quickly. Right. They have not been worried about the price side of this until recently. Right? And they still believe that these are temporary problems, and they may well be temporary. Right? The thought here, though, is that if these stay too high for too long, they can actually work against the recovery. All right. When's the last time we had recessions that were essentially driven by supply shocks? Looking back to the 70s and early 80s, we had the classic one that we focus on was supply shock associated with the OPEC embargo. When we talk about this in economics classes at Marquette, you get these these blank stares. They don't remember the 70s. They don't remember the 90s because a lot of our incoming students were born after the new millennium, right? I think 21-year-olds right now, 18, 21-year-olds were born in 2001, 2002. But that supply shock was something that generated something called stagflation, continued inflation, and that inflation then kept the economy from growing. A typical recession leads to lower price when the economy. This is one where the supply shock generated inflation even as the economy was growing. And that's because it wasn't demand driven, it was supply. So that's the concern. Finally, you've got some of the policy decisions that have been made in Washington, generating challenges that ultimately may be inflationary. So one of them is deficit spending. Deficit spending stimulates the demand side of the economy. You have more consumers spending money, more investors spending money, government spending money. Okay, and so the red line is basically saying you have kind of balanced spending, and you can see that this is a monthly figure.
And so you can see that there are months during the year where the government's taking more money than it's spending. But in general, these tend to be in the negative domain. Certainly on an annual basis, they're negative. And you can see the deficit spending exploded. The more negative, the greater the deficit. The more positive, the greater the surplus. These exploded as we got into 2020. Okay, and so one might think, well, that's going to help grow the economy, and it certainly does, but it can generate inflation. And then finally, look at the increase in the money supply. This is M2. Okay, M2. So think of the money supply as focusing on the amount of liquidity that's in the market. So it's deposits and checking. M2 also includes deposits in a number of savings accounts. Okay, the highly liquid financial accounts that people can take. It doesn't include retirement accounts, those types of things, those are less liquid. But you can see that this has been growing, and it always is on a growth path. This is going back to 1960. All right, it's really exploded since 2020. So the concern among a lot of economists is this is growing at an unhealthy clip. What the Fed is telling us is we can pull this back. And they signal that they intend to stop their asset buying, stop their asset. Pare that back because there's a concern that so in any case, all of these things, though, can be the other concern, though, is if they pull back, if they reduce the money supply, that can contract the economy and perhaps towards a recession sooner than would otherwise be the case. Okay, so really all this boils down to is we've got a lot of uncertainty in the economy. I don't want to overplay it. The economy is still on a healthy growth path. I know we're growing off a much smaller base than we had, but we've almost recovered the real output that was lost. We've recovered relatively quickly. Okay, and so in general. In general, the economy is expanding. There are some headwinds, but most economists are suggesting that by most economists, I mean those who are doing forecasts of the macro. They're suggesting that the economy will continue to grow at a pace that will So now with this economic backdrop, we know that we've had. I think describing this as a red hot market is completely appropriate. We've been selling as quickly as they get listed, often in a very short time window. Saying that realtors are doing a good job of moving those properties once they get there, closing those deals in a very expeditious fashion. Okay, so if we look at kind of the annual trends here, you can see that 2020 in terms of sales was a record year. We sold more, closed on more have, since we've been tracking this data using our right now, we have very accurate data. WRA. We have very accurate data reflecting sales, right? It basically comes out of the MLS. It's down to the transaction level. Very accurate approach, and so we actually go back to 2005 when we recalibrated our data.
There we go.
And so last year we hit about 88,600 homes were sold. That was most of it. And while we don't have data going before this, given the population has been growing consistently over time. This is the highest level. And it's been hovering in the 80,000 units sold range since 2016. And our prices, again, they are as high as they've ever been. On average, in 2020, they reached 220,000. That's the first time they ended up north of 200,000 price, median price of $200,000. They certainly have been going up faster than the rate of inflation. Okay. It's the story that has been consistent over the last 2 years is we have a mismatch between supply and demand. Okay, we have tight supply. We have very strong. So let's just look at this. The demand side. First of all, the primary drivers are mortgage rates, the labor market, and demographics. So we'll just focus on each of them. Mortgage rates. You see this big, right? But it's important to just remind people where we stand relative to historical norms. And bought my first house in 1985. It was a great time to buy a house. I got a 7.75% fixed rate mortgage. The realtor at that time said, "This is the best time to buy a house." You were so lucky. And if I'm comparing to where they are today, I'm not so lucky. But if you compare it to where they had been just several years ago, you can see that we topped out at about 18.5% for 30 years. I was lucky. All right, I hit the exact right time compared to the last 5 years. But these guys are really lucky. All right, and you look at where we've been up until through the third quarter. We were typically below 3%. Okay, it hit bottom in December of 2020 when it stood at 2.68%. But we really have seen just kind of minor fluctuations. All right, I think of it as less than 50 basis points between the high and the low over that period. But it has been just for the last couple of months. It's been drifting up a little bit. And so again, we're at 3.07% in October. That's still very low by historical standards. State employment, and you can see. So this is not employment. The data has been adjusted for seasonal. So these are seasonally adjusted data. You can see Wisconsin non-farm employment. Dropped as a result of the recession, but it is bouncing back. We are not back to the levels we were prior to the economic shutdown. And the right is simply looking at the percentage change. So that the growth has been positive since end of 2020, and continues to show some growth. We have had a couple of months where the national unemployment, the jobs creation numbers have been disappointing. Right. With that said, we're at least moving in the right direction. And then finally, looking at the unemployment rate, you can see that the unemployment rate, well, it peaked at about 14.8%, both for the state and it's fallen more quickly in the state than it is at the national level. But then even the national level is getting close to what economists consider to be full employment. So why isn't full employment 0% unemployment? Well, it's not 0% unemployment because there's always frictional unemployment and structural unemployment in the economy. Structural unemployment is those whose skills have eroded to the point where they don't qualify for jobs that they would accept. Frictional unemployment is simply people moving from one job to another. All right, and so that move from one job to another can sometimes result in a short period where people are technically unemployed. So in any case, we are close to that point where unemployment rates are at least at the national level, we're slightly above full employment level of unemployment. And certainly at the state level, we are right at that 4% benchmark. And then finally, demographics. Right? This is a national picture, but it would be reflected statewide if I could find that. But at any rate, what it's showing is that the number of households. The one on the left is basically looking at household growth from a couple of different surveys. These are both surveys that are conducted by the Bureau of the Census. One is the Housing Vacancy Survey, the other is the American Community Survey. And so it's looking at, think of it very simply as someone who can form their own household. Do they do so or do they remain with their parents? Okay? So if you set up a unique household, you're no longer living in your parents. Right, after graduation, you're no longer living with your parents. And you can see that both of those bars on the left, the blue bar and the purple bar, have been moving up. Households are being formed as people move through their 20s and 30s. And then you can see on the right. And again, this is a little more dated, and that's simply because some of the American Community Survey data is updated with a little bit of a lag. These are charts that come from an annual report called the State of the Nation's Housing. It's issued every year, and it's free to obtain. It's great reading. You might want to do it if you're trying to go to sleep at night. But it's actually a very good document. It comes from the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard, right? And so I read it every time it comes out. But you can see that the number of households and this is looking at growth. The growth for the under 35 group back in 2017 was tiny. Green bar is barely, green portion of the bar is barely perceptible. By 2018, it increased substantially and essentially doubled from 2018 to 2019. So there is a clear demographic shift of those in the under 35 category to form their own residence. So the demand side is not surprisingly strong. growth, lower unemployment rates. You've got demographics pushing more individuals to form their own. Supply side, though, is the challenge. So if you look at available supply, we put out something called months of inventory. You look at the available inventory, you look at how many homes were sold on average for the most recent inventory divided by sales. That'll tell you how many months of supply would be available given current consumption. And so a balanced market is in general around 6 months. So neither buyers nor sellers have an advantage of having 6 months of supply. This number is cyclical, by the way. Inventory peaks, tends to peak in the winter months when fewer people are buying, and tends to hit its low ebb at the peak of the housing market when lots of people are buying, right? But you can see, what's important to notice is the downward drift. And it's also important to note that since about 2017, we've been in a seller's market. Below that bar, that balanced benchmark is representing a seller's market. And the further below that you are, the more of a seller, the stronger is the seller's market. When you are north of the bar, that's a buyer's market. And the further up you are, the stronger is the buyer's market. So it was really high coming out of the Great Recession. Lots of inventory, not a lot of people. Okay? It's very low and it's continued to be declining since about 2017. Okay? If you break this down by the type of county that you're looking at, the type of market, we have what are called metropolitan counties. Metropolitan counties are counties that are part of metropolitan areas. Metropolitan areas are combinations of counties. So Ozaukee County is within the Milwaukee metropolitan area, which includes Milwaukee, Ozaukee, Washington, and Washington. And we've seen, if you look at what are called consolidated metropolitan areas. These are unique metropolitan areas that have kind of grown together a bit. And so think of them simply as our larger counties. Okay? We've moved from 4.2 months of supply in 2019, September 2019, 3.5 months in September 2020, 3.1 months. It's tight. Sellers have a stronger advantage now than they did 2 years ago. Okay? Micropolitan counties. These are small towns. They have at least 10,000 population. All right? And so these are counties that aren't large enough to be considered metropolitan areas or components of metropolitan areas. You need at least 50,000 population in the county for that to happen. Okay? For micropolitan counties, you need to have at least 10,000 people in the county, but it can't quite hit the 50,000, so 49,999. Okay, those have tightened 5.8, so it basically balanced 2 years ago, down to 3.5. And then finally, rural counties. Rural counties are rural counties are those that really have less than 10,000 people in the county, right? They were a strong buyer's advantage just 2 years ago. They became a seller's advantage in 1 year. What Jay was talking about, his brother who was retiring from Illinois was thinking of buying a place in a rural area. And thought it was a great time to do that until they recognized, wow, it's a seller's advantage even there. Okay? And so every type of town is really a seller's advantage and a growing seller's advantage. So what we really have three different sources of supply: distressed properties, properties going into foreclosure, existing homes, and new construction. So what's the problem here? This is actually a good picture. This is our foreclosure picture. It used to be the case that Russ Cation would, he's a professor at University of Wisconsin, would publish this data on an annual basis. That really stopped in 2018. But you can see, you know, this the foreclosures essentially peaked back in 2009, 2010, and then they've fallen since that time. But I found some other data. This Adam account comes from RealtyTrack. Adam is the parent company of RealtyTrack, and you can see that looking at the January to June 2021 period, comparing it to where we were January to June back in 2019, these new filings of foreclosures are down 71%. So what's happening is they are simply not a growing source of supply. And in part, that's a good thing, because it's indicating that fewer people are being forced out of their home because of financial challenges. But it doesn't help us on the supply side. Second thing is listings of existing homes. This is really our primary source of supply. And so we track this on a monthly basis. You can see that looking at the September, for new listings, they're down about 7.3%. Okay. For total listings, they're down about 9.5%. This is about as low as we've seen for listings. Okay, and again, listings are also seasonal. And then finally, new construction. This is the left side is permits for the state of Wisconsin, all units. All right, single family and multi. But the Wisconsin Builders Association puts out regular reports that show that even if you look at single family permits, those are up. They're up by a healthy margin. So the overall state picture, though, is one where we've got sales that are down in the second half of the year. All right, you can see that for the month of September, 8.6%, prices were up 6.6%. On a year-to-date basis, you can see that sales are still up. That would suggest, well, maybe we're going to be able to eclipse the record year for sales, more than 88,000 sales for the full year. Maybe we're going to be able to surpass that in 2021. However, the problem is this monthly pattern has continued for a couple of months, and I think it will persist. So there's a little bit of good news here and a little bit of bad news. The good news is that we're seeing some moderation on price. All right, it's going up 6.6% on an annualized basis. So compared to this time last year, September, prices are up 6.6%. That's well below the double-digit increases that we were seeing going up throughout June. So August and September, they've been in between 6 and 7%. That's moderation. Okay, you know, year to date they're still 9.6. The first 9 months of this year compared to the first 9 months of last year, still up 9.6%. But there's this clear movement towards below double-digit increases. That's an indication things are cooling off a little bit. They're not going down, right? But they're getting back to sustainable levels of growth in prices. But the unit sales are really being hurt by the fact that we still have very low inventory. And that low inventory, realtors can't sell homes that aren't on the market. And so you're doing a great job of selling homes that are on the market, moving them quickly, but that those inventory problems continue to be significant problems for us. And so what's happening is this year-to-date figure will continue to inch down. I suspect that we are not going to be able to hit a new record level. With that said, we are still going to be in the mid upper 80,000. Well, we might have to hit 88,600, but we're probably going to be north of 85,000. That's a great year, all right, by any definition. So now we get to the point where we need to talk about what I think is going to happen. There should be another quote. So forecasting is always something that you do with a little bit of trepidation. Not sure who the author was on this, but economists have forecasted that the last 5 recessions. That's pretty good. The second one is econometrician. Econometricians are simply economists that do work with data. And his point is the two things that you're better off not watching are it really isn't the fact that when I come up with these projections, I don't really flip a coin, but it is still an educated guess at this. All right. Here's my thoughts. So last year's predictions, I always kept holding myself. Well, I probably shouldn't be built. So what did I say last year? I said the recession will end by Q1 of 2021. This was a March and April. By May of 2020, we were out. This was the safest prediction. I already knew that GDP growth was positive by the time we got here. All right. So kind of a gimme, but I'll take credit for it. Mortgage rates will increase but remain below 4%. They have. So here they decreased for a little bit. They have started moving up. The big point is they started. Okay. The third one, median prices will grow at more than twice the rate of inflation through September of 2021. I almost got this. The problem is inflation jumped up to 5.4%, which meant that I needed prices to go up by 10.8%. They were up 9.6%. So I just barely missed this. I didn't think inflation was going to spike as much as it did, but that's a miss. Months of inventory will generally improve, but by modest margins. I have been saying this for 3 years. I'm going to say it again because I think eventually I'm going to be right. All right? But quite frankly, I'm not the only one that's been saying we're going to start seeing some improvements on the inventory front, and we haven't seen it yet. I just don't think they can go much lower. All right, I think that eventually we'll start seeing improvements. Right now, we are selling everything that comes on the market. At some point, we'll start gaining some traction. Baby boomers can't hold out forever. Right? Eventually, they've got to sell their homes in transition. They just don't seem to be doing it at a very healthy clip, right? And I'm the one. We're empty nesters. You know, we got a 2,500 square foot colonial that we could easily move out. It's just a hassle, right? It's not the realtor side. You guys make it easy. It's all the stuff that is in that, right? So, what else did I say? Sales and median prices will be on a pace to break another annual record by September. I'm going to kind of give myself a check. There probably should be a check and an X there. I don't think we're going to hit record sales. We obviously hit record prices, right? But at least by September, we were above the pace of last year. So, and the Packers are winning NFC North. I was spot on there. If I had been a bit more aggressive, I would have talked about the Bucks, but I'm a little more conservative. So, in any case, this year's predictions. I don't think we're going to have a recession this year. I think the economy will continue to grow. Those predictions by analysts are starting to moderate a little bit. They're still saying positive growth through 2022, 2023, and those that go out 3 years are even saying 2020. Okay, and I think that's a good estimate. I think inflation will be at or above 3.5% by 2022. That's a pretty easy prediction as well. But there are some predictions that are saying that we will be in the 2 to 3%. I think it's going to be more difficult to unwind the price pressures from energy and these supply chain issues. I think will take a while to sort themselves out. They will sort themselves out, but it'll take a while. I'm just going to keep saying months of inventory will improve my box margins until maybe until they pour dirt on me. I don't know, but hopefully that will improve this year. Let's see, mortgage rates will remain between 3 and 5%. I don't think they're going to get much higher than that, but I do think we'll be in the 3% range, maybe 4% range by September of next year. Year to date, housing prices will be up by less than 9%. So I think this below 10% is likely to continue. How much below 9%? My point estimate would probably be about 6 to 7%, but I'm hedging a bit, saying about 9%. Year-to-date sales will be above the pace this year. That will probably put them close to an all-time record. I don't know if we'll get 90,000 and something. Again, the problem is saying before. So, and then the last point that I would make is there have been people say, are we going to have? I can say the perfect storm that existed when we had the bubble in 2007. You had an awful lot of people who were put it. As soon as the economy plateaued, had no ability to service those mortgages, especially given that there were a lot of teaser rates. Okay, and I'm not saying that necessarily was the case in places like Wisconsin, but there were the mortgage meltdown didn't result from things that were done in Wisconsin. It resulted from things that were done in California, Arizona, Nevada, Florida. We are not in that type of environment. Underwriting standards have improved, and it's not the case that people are getting mortgages with no doc loans. These no doc loans aren't out there anymore. All right. In fact, down payments have increased. People who are buying homes are typically credit poor. Right? There is not significant risk of mortgage-backed securities collapsing the way they did in 2007, 2008. Right? This is not the bubble was really created by demand side challenges and the collapse of demand in the housing market, not by challenges on supply. All right, so we are simply not in a situation where we're likely to see a bubble. if the economy were to move into a significant recession, foreclosure rates would increase, but they wouldn't explode. So with that said, to answer any questions this morning.
For your predictions for like months of inventory and the increases, year to year on sales, were those also including construction or land, or were those just existing homes?
So when we're talking about inventory, that includes homes that it's certainly existing sales. There's a little bit of a quirk in the way we compute these things. They're all computed through the MLS. So if a new construction, so if someone is building a house for one buyer, one contractor, that's typically not going to show up in the MLS. To the extent that it does show up in the MLS, that would include those numbers. Really, what's primarily driving those months of inventory numbers, though, are existing homes, not new homes. The new homes will improve the circumstances, but they won't necessarily get picked up in those months of inventory figures. I'm relying primarily on the months of inventory figures from existing homes. I think it's CNN, we use the term untimely. Yeah, you've got 330 million people nationally. Every death. I don't think that those numbers drive housing market. So I think that captured lost 5, 6, 7 million people, and especially those that are really other questions? Yes. Yeah, so that's this question. There's some interesting kind of dynamics with this statement. All right. One of the arguments is as prices of gasoline rise, you cause people who are working in downtown are actually the central part of the problem. That when they're looking for homes, that was kind of the narrative that existed pre-COVID. That higher gas prices to support people desire to move closer to parts of cities. However, we have a couple things that are different. One of them is people can live in more remote locations and still, and they may have to come in because if they're coming in every day, that reduces those commuting expenses. That makes it less likely that they're going to be looking for homes. I think the other thing is some of the other factors that have transpired in cities may make those more central locations a bit more challenging, a bit less palatable, I should say. higher crime rates, some of the challenges in some of the school districts, I think make it less likely that people are going to be looking for homes in those more central locations to the detriment of suburban. The last thing I would say is there was this narrative that was out there that suggested that millennials don't want to live in the suburbs. Right? First, there was this narrative they don't want to comfortable living in apartment settings, and they want to be where the action is, which is down. Right? That's fine when you're single or when you're married. That's a little less desirable once you start forming house. Right? Yeah. That's our. So there's this kind of revisiting that particular prediction that millennials don't live in suburbs. We're seeing lots of sales for millennials who are starting to have children. That's when you start thinking about more space. That's when you start thinking about schools. All of those tend to favor more suburban. So I don't think that we're going to see problems in suburban housing. I also don't think that we're going to see higher gas prices. But any other questions? Yeah. So they still have plenty of tools. They've already signaled that they can stop raising the money supply as aggressive as they are going to keep their asset buying program. When they buy assets, they pay money to the owners of that money was up in the money supply. That's what causes more and more of that activity, that activity. When they taper, when they reduce those purchases, they and ultimately sell some of those assets. That then pulls money out of the in doing so, it puts upward pressure on things like interest rates and things that will diminish the economic activity, keep the economy open, pull those inflationary pressures down. The other thing is supply side issues. I think will ultimately supply chain problems will eventually resolve. The labor shortages will eventually resolve themselves as well. Have higher wages, but overall, I think that the likelihood of high levels of inflation are pretty low. So, all in all, I think the Fed will manage inflation effectively. I also think that some of the challenges in Washington are going to diminish as well, mainly because I don't think that the amount of spending that's been proposed by Trump will be infrastructure bills that is tied to a lot of growth and social programs. The elections are probably going to put additional downward pressure on passing major spending. We don't need more spending. Other questions? All right, well, once again, a pleasure to be here, and thanks to Washington State Bank and for the invitation. I always enjoy it.